We are the image of God. That is, we are his physical representatives so that we can rule over creation on his behalf.
The Bible is made for this. Like, it talks about supernatural entities that are real, that aren't imaginary. And I think the church has to wake up to this.
Do you think that whenever she came out of the water, that there was a demon came out of her?
It's like, I can understand that, because our human nature is to, take the blessings that God gives us and then forget about them tomorrow.
There is an intelligence at war against them. And I think what I'm suggesting is that there are still intelligences that we're at war against.
I really like what Dr. Michael Heiser said a lot, is that God's desire is to dwell with mankind forever.
All of the nations in the world have been assigned a particular overseeing guardian to watch over them. But that in particular, the nation of Israel has been designated to be solely God's chosen nation.
The Word gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone.
But our enemy has not laid down their arms. Their power is broken. Christ is King, the Lord of Lords, the God of gods, mighty and awesome.
I was at one time the fastest sword driller in the county. Hello and welcome to the Two Trees Podcast. My name is Martin Listener, and if I sound different, it's because I'm all the way down here at the end of the table tonight. We have a full group with us here tonight. We'll get into who all is coming to this episode here in just a second, but I've been given the opportunity to intro because I am the best at doing it. That's obviously at least what I think. Mm-hmm. And we haven't said this in a couple episodes, so we need to really go into how you can help us out here at the Two Trees. We love coming in here and we love recording and all the feedback that you guys give us. But if you haven't been to our Facebook page as of yet, you need to go there. Facebook.com, sign in the app, however you do it. Type in Two Trees Podcast. We're right there. It's free to join. There's nothing you have to do, and we will accept you. There's a lot of awesome chatter, a lot of stuff that John posts on there. Sometimes Jacob sends up videos of his chickens and doing whatever, the evil one that was. But any of that stuff. But also, if you really want to help, go to wherever you're listening to this podcast and give us a review, especially if you're on an iPhone or any Apple device where you can go there. Leave us a review, leave us a like, and comment something. It's really great for the algorithm, gets everything out there, and allows us to go even farther than we've already reached, which is much farther than I ever imagined we would go. So I think that's all that I needed to do for the intro as of yet. John's looking at me kind of confused. I got the okay.
No, that's just my normal face.
Okay.
I am not very intelligent most of the time. Trying to process what's going on. But we do have a full house here. We have the Right Reverend Jacob Kessling.
What's up, guys?
Monsignor Nick Church.
Hello.
Rose Moeller.
Hi, everybody.
And His Royal Highness Martin Listener.
Hey, y'all.
Everyone's favorite listener.
It's here.
Depending on who you ask. But no, we're excited. We're continuing our discussion of the golden calf. And we're going to be kind of looking at what was happening in the background within the supernatural world. Does the Bible give us any indication that this is more than just a group of humans collectively deciding to do dumb things? And before we start, I just want to say humans are fully capable of doing dumb stuff all on our own. Absolutely. I don't need any help to sin. I am awesome at it. And you are too. You're good at excuses. But remember that this isn't just a sin. This is a moment where Eden is once again on offer. God has brought the people back to a moment. This level of supernatural extravagance hasn't happened in a really, really long time, if ever. And so it would make sense that the supernatural community, the gods of Egypt, the fallen watchers, would be very interested in what God was up to and try to resist it. And so we're going to take a look at the text and try to talk about, what exactly is happening. And does the Bible give us any indication of what's happening behind the curtain, behind the supernatural invisibility barrier, I guess you could say. But really just to kind of give us some background, Moses has been missing. He's been gone for 40 days. And it's not like he just disappeared for a couple hours and then everyone lost their minds. He's been gone for over a month. and Israel is worried. They're beginning to think that maybe this whole Sinai experiment was a terrible idea, and that if Moses wasn't able to survive on the mountain, that they are going to need help in surviving a relationship with this God as well. And they look back into their past. Their leaders decide to try not just to be in a relationship with the Lord, but to take control of the situation. They want to control God, similar to what was going on at the Tower of Babel. And they look back to Egypt and its culture, and they make a golden calf. In last episode, we talked a lot about how calves were seen in the ancient Middle Eastern world, in Egypt especially, but also up into Mesopotamia. And what we're continuing the story is that God looks down to Moses and he says, listen, something is really wrong. Your people have broken the covenant, and they all need to die. And basically what happens is Moses steps up to intercede for Israel. Now, the last time he was up on this mountain and God told him to go and to do something, to go and to rescue Israel, Moses is very hesitant. He more or less is saying over and over and over again, don't send me, send someone else. Don't send me, send someone else. And at this moment, Moses totally redeems himself. There's this epic intercession where Moses takes a stand and looks to God and says, Lord, let me stand in the gap for my people. And the Lord has this really intense conversation with him and more or less says, listen, this is much more serious than you think it is. And then the story progresses with Moses coming down the mountain. So I want you to imagine for just a moment that you're convinced this man is dead. He has gone up the mountain into the supernatural world where the flashes of lightning and thunder, where the voices and the trumpets have been calling, and then out of that mist, out of that cloud comes Moses. It would have been a very creepy thing to see. I'm sure people wondered, is that really Moses? Is that the ghost of Moses? What exactly is going on here? But it doesn't translate well to the flannel graph board to talk to children that way. And so we kind of cut this out. But it's this moment where Moses returns from the court of the Lord and is now addressing the problem that Israel is facing. And so let's pick up the story in verse 15 through 20. If I could get a friend to read.
There's too many of us. We don't know who to read first.
Rose, would you read for me, please?
I am on it, but I actually wanted to point out just real quick, that entire recap you did is all out of Exodus 32.
Oh, yes.
So far. So when you say pick it up, we're partway through the chapter.
Yeah, we've been using this as our main text. Exodus 32 is our main text again tonight, although we're going to be in Hosea and Habakkuk and some other weird places that actually have content to give us into this event. We're even going to get to the book of Acts because it's awesome.
And it's new season, New Testament.
Oh,
so,
yes.
Okay, then Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, tablets that were written on both sides. On the front and on the back they were written. The tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. When Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, "There is a noise of war in the camp." But he said, "It is not the sound of shouting for victory or the sound of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing that I hear." And as soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf that they had made and burned it with fire and ground it to powder and scattered it on the water and made the people of Israel drink it.
All right, so this is an intense text. And if you're beginning in verse 15, it may feel like the author is really excited to tell you about these tablets. He says it like 6 different ways, back and forth. He says 2 tablets of the testimony on his hand, and the tablets were written on both sides, on the front and on the back. The tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God, engraved on the tablets. It's this repetition. He's trying to draw the attention of the people that God has spoken, and this is a lawgiver. The idea of these tablets is that they're a covenant between the people. They're a treaty between the nation of Israel and God as their suzerain king. And in case you're wondering, I always thought like God just used giant handwriting and couldn't fit all of his writing on one tablet, and so 2 tablets were needed, and the front and the back. I mean, he only wrote 10 sayings on this tablet. And so it kind of felt to me very strange. But most likely in ancient cultures, what typically happened is that there would be one copy of the treaty given to you, and then another treaty copy would be kept by the person that was giving the treaty. Now, in Israel's case, both of these tablets are going to be kept, well, if they had survived, they would have been kept in the tabernacle that's going to be made. And so I don't know. I guess I always thought like God struggled like writing really little. You know, he had to use like giant 5,000 font to picture this. But I don't even know like for real what the tablets look like. I always picture Charlton Heston lugging down these gigantic rounded tablets of stone.
So you're saying that typically they would each have a copy of whatever covenant it was.
This actually is something that any ancient reader living in any ancient city would have made total sense to them. Well, you obviously need two copies.
So why did Moses have both of them? I mean, God didn't need his own copy, probably.
Well,
So
it was this idea of mankind, the physical world, is again part of the story. That God has a need and a want for a human family. This was part of his creation. That he doesn't just desire to rule the heavens, but that he is the God of gods, the Lord of lords here on the earth as well. And this is something that hasn't happened, I don't think, since Adam was really given a command to guard and to keep and to work and to keep the garden. And so this is a really beautiful instance. Does God need it? No. But it's God doing something that everyone there should have understood. And they did. They would have recognized right away what was going on. Oh, God is our king. He's the one who has made this treaty with us. It's not just Pharaoh or some conquering army, but our treaty is with the God of gods. Our treaty is with the Lord himself. And this would have been a very prestigious thing for the Israelites to have been given. No other nation was given anything like this. Not even Abraham has something like this. It's down in writing. That's spectacular. And so then the story moves on, and in verse 17, we find that as Moses approaches the base of the mountain, he runs into Joshua, who seems to have been waiting for him. Although that's kind of upsetting. No one seems to have been worried about where Joshua was, but they are worried about where Moses is. And Joshua, who again is going to be the successor to Moses, is kind of given a highlight here. He is on the mountain with the Lord, not as close to him as Moses was, but he's still there. And then he begins to say to Moses, I'm hearing some very strange things from down in the camp. And the language that's used for the rest of this chapter is war language. It's not temptation. It's not, do I believe in God anymore? There's a war taking place. And Joshua begins to say this. He says, I hear the noise of war in the camp. And Moses says, oh, no, you don't. That's not the shouting of victory. That's not the cry of defeat, but that's worship, I hear. And so you have this imagery, and the author is setting this up so that we're not supposed to read this just as a fall into sin. We're to read this as a rebellion against the king. They were told what to do. They knew that God was there, and they have rejected him. They have attempted to take power and to take control of the situation for themselves. And it's interesting because Moses has been really calm, cool, and collected up to this point. He was very kind when he was talking to God. Oh, forgive them, Lord. Oh, protect them, Lord. Oh, don't judge them too harshly. But when Moses gets down the mountain, he throws the tablets at them. This is kind of like Jesus overthrowing the money changers' tables and things like it. So when most people think of Moses, I don't think they picture him chucking the 10 Commandments at people. I don't know, maybe you guys do.
Well, I just am curious was Moses expecting this when he's coming down the mountain? The reaction of his people? Because the way I'm kind of taking this and reading this is Moses is their representative up there, and he's up there for a long time. I don't know if he feels like it's been a long time or it's just a blink of an eye for him up there. I'm not sure how it works in the spiritual, physical realm overlapping type of idea. But it seems like he's up there basically, lobbying for his people with God is how I'm kind of taking it a little bit. I'm not saying he's changing God's mind or he's telling God what to do, but he's a representative of it. And so when he comes back down, I would think he's going to expect his people to be like, oh, Moses is back. Great. Now God is wonderful and all this. And in fact, they're doing the opposite.
Yeah. I think there's a little bit of an element here of it's easy to judge something that you've heard about, but seeing it is a different matter. when your nose is rubbed in it and you can't avoid it and you're witnessing it yourself, your emotions are going to flare up. And we know Moses is a very emotional fella. He's already murdered a man back in Egypt. He's fought off bandits and things in the wilderness. He's a very powerful personality. But it's important for us to look at this and to recognize that this isn't a ridiculous action. He's not supposed to cry out from the stones, "Don't worry, everything is okay. Everything is fine. You know, God's just going to wink at this sin and it's not going to be a problem. What you have done, you didn't understand really what you were up to." This is a threat, not just to the covenant, but to everybody who's living in the camp. There has been an invasion of the camp, and it isn't from the Amalekites or from the Amorites or even from the Egyptians. The threat that has invaded them is a supernatural threat.
See, and the point I'm trying to make earlier, I think, is so self-centered. Like Moses is like, "Hey, I'm up there doing all this work for you guys. Like I'm your representative." And now all of a sudden you've kind of stabbed me in the back, or you've gone around what I think you guys are. And so I'm looking at it from a self-centered standpoint, but it's almost like Moses was like, "What are you guys doing? This is all for Yahweh. And now you guys have turned against him." He doesn't care about himself. He's not like, "Oh, you've made me look bad, Moses." He's saying, "You're fighting against the God that we love."
There's a very real sense in which this text is about a war that's happening in the camp. This isn't Moses struggling with forgiveness issues on his own. This is a battle that's taking place for the camp. And the first thing that he does is break the treaty because he says, "We've already broken it. These mean nothing because of our actions." And he smashes them. He doesn't give them to the people.
Well, sorry, I didn't mean to
go
interrupt.
ahead.
Alongside that, I just wonder if you are just seeing a little bit of Moses' humanity here, because when he's up on the mountain with the Lord kind of gives him a clue what's going on. And the Lord says, "I've seen how stubborn and rebellious my people are." And Moses he intercedes for them. But then when he sees how stubborn, literally, and rebellious they are, the Lord had said, "Leave me alone so my anger can blaze against them." Well, his anger blazes against them. I mean, he throws a massive temper tantrum, slams that down, grinds up gold, makes them drink it. This is epic, discipline.
Yeah. And this is the kind of thing that, and I know that part where it says, "And he made the people drink it," is to give you, it's a jump forward in the story. You're supposed to know God at no point loses. This is the Lord defeating the enemy at the foot of his mountain. There's been an invasion. There is now the worship of false gods amongst his people at the very foot of the place where God's court is dwelling upon the mountain, and the Lord drives it out. There's a punishment that takes place here. There's some interesting Leviticus connections here, but I will never finish our outline if we come anywhere close to getting into that debacle. But let's jump into the battle sequence here. So, Martin, would you read Exodus 32, verses 25 through 29?
And when Moses saw that the people had broken loose, for Aaron had let them break loose to the derision of the enemies, then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, who is on the Lord's side? Come to me. And all the sons of Levi gathered around him. And he said to them, Thus says the Lord God of Israel, Put your sword on your side, each of you, and go to and fro from gate to gate throughout the camp, and each of you kill his brother and his companion and his neighbor. And the sons of Levi did according to the words of Moses. And that day about 3,000 men of the people fell. And Moses said, Today you have been ordained for the service of the Lord, each one at the cost of his son and his brother, so that he might bestow a blessing upon you today.
Now, this should be a movie. This is a battle sequence. Moses calls to the people who is on the Lord's side, and that's a fascinating text. But I think there's an interesting statement beforehand that it can be easy to miss and to push on to the other parts. It says in verse 25, Moses saw that the people had broken loose, for Aaron had let them break loose to the derision of their enemies. So just take a look at that for a second. I assume you guys are out there reading along with us. First of all, poor Aaron. Not only did he make the golden calf, but the text wants you to know that all of the things that are happening, this worship of the pagan deities, this absolute loss of morality that's taking place, happens with Aaron's blessing.
Can you, work on the phrase break loose for a little bit?
Yeah, break loose is that idea of imagine like a group of cattle in a pen and that they're enclosed by the fence, that this would be acceptable behavior. Stay inside the corral.
I grew up on a farm. I can vividly picture it.
And then to break loose is to burst the bonds
So-
and to go
The
wherever
NIV
they
says
want to
running
go.
wild.
Running wild?
Okay.
Oh,
All right.
Okay.
Okay. Well, then that maybe answers a question. I'm just remembering earlier in Exodus, there's a distinct phrase, sort of the same. It says, do not let them break through or I might break out or something. The Lord's talking to them in the mountain language.
Yeah, it's using sacred geography.
Okay.
The idea is that this is the space for this. If you come past this, you're defining right and wrong for yourself. The Lord has set a line. And he does this later with the tabernacle and later with the temple, the Holy of Holies. No one's supposed to go in there except the high priest. And there's a line that's given. This is why it's so cool that Jesus, when he dies, the temple veil is torn from the top to the bottom. This is God directing who can go where, not mankind directing who can go where. And so what seems to have happened is the Israelites have looked at this, and maybe this started with good intentions, but it is well past that. And everyone is now just running around doing whatever they want. And then it gives this strange line, to the derision of their enemies. So here's the question. Who is watching them?
Like, you think literally there's people standing there mocking them?
Well, apparently that's what's happening. It says that the people have broken loose. Aaron had let them break loose to the derision of their enemies.
Is this the Egyptians that fled with them?
Well,
of Egypt?
they wouldn't have been enemies. They would
Well,
have
that's
been,
true. I mean,
they would have been followers of Yahweh at that
they
point.
certainly are watching God's people behave like Egyptians.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, that's a possibility. We know they've been fighting Amorites, Amalekites. Those people seem to have been driven off. They're not parked anywhere with other nations watching them. They're on their own. These are the people of Israel, and yet they seem to be acting in such a way that they have brought shame onto the Lord and onto themselves. Someone is watching them. Now, the Bible tells us that there are beings that are not humans, that are also intelligent beings. They're supernatural. And that there are supernatural beings that accuse the brethren, accuse people before the Lord. There's this really great sequence in the book of Zechariah that talks about this. There's this element in which humans are observed by supernatural beings. It matters what we do and why we do it. And so if you're reading this text and you're only thinking that this is human beings at play, then you have to think to yourself, well, maybe there were some like Moabites camped out far away with like their telescope out trying to watch, binoculars out there like snipers and ghillie suits and that kind of a thing. Or you're left wondering, were there other beings here?
Well, and I think Rose is on the right track with the break loose mentality. If you think of it like cattle and they got outside of the fence, then that would be the farmer or the shepherd that is trying to herd them back in. But what is the breaking loose? They're not just running different places like, oh, I stepped out of the city wall or I stepped outside of the ordinance where this is all set. So they're doing something, I think, morally incorrect.
This seems to be sexual in nature. This seems to be they are treating the worship of Yahweh as though they would treat the worship of any of the other pagan gods. They have said, well, okay, we're changing direction. We're gonna do what feels right. I'll decide what's right and what's wrong.
So if this was a physical thing, like they were in the wrong space, then, the police would come and saddle them up and bring them back to where they needed to go or round them back up. But if this is something bigger than that, like a spiritual thing or a morality thing that they're outside of,
Yeah, I think it's all of these things.
then it would
I
be
think-
the moral police,
Yeah,
right?
there would have
so
been-
Who would that be?
The moral police.
that would be God. That would
Right.
be the Lord.
So that's the
and his
enemies that
host.
we're talking of.
Yeah, these are people who are opposed to them. Their actions have set them against the Lord. To remember that Mount Sinai is not just the place where the Lord is, but we've heard the trumpets. We've seen that the court of the Lord is moving with Israel through the wilderness. This is a place where the spiritual beings have congregated on both sides. And there's an element here of a snake in Eden. At the very foot of the mountain, just like happened last time, there's been a temptation to take and to define right and wrong for yourself.
Well, I think, maybe this is jumping ahead, but the very next sentence, who is on the Lord's side, would kind of follow along with that idea.
Moses calls for the people who are still loyal to Yahweh. And it's interesting that they respond as a tribe. Moses' relatives respond. By the way, some of these guys they're not great people. You're going to meet Korah and his buddies later on in the text, and they're not always wonderful people, but at this moment, they recognize this is bad, and this is really dangerous. Something is happening here, because just a few pages ago, these were loyal followers of Yahweh. They've set up a golden cow, and suddenly their actions are crazed. There's a spirit of rebelliousness. There's this sense of wildness that's taken place. And Moses calls for swords around him. And he says, rally to me. We're going to go in there and destroy that calf. And if you're thinking about this in terms of a supernatural idol, that an idol is a possessed object, that it is the calling of a spirit to indwell a thing. And suddenly these men are being asked, will you side with the Lord against the enemies of the Lord? I always think of what's the guy, Gideon, when he smashes the Baal and his stuff. And we kind of got into this in the territorial spirits. But there's a temptation to only read this through the lens of humanity and to see this only as a story about a group of people who used to believe in God, but they don't anymore. Now they're worshiping this cow. It's so much more than that. This is an attempt to make God do things their way. They're trying to control it. And now a battle has broken loose in the camp itself. And the Levites, it says, put your sword on your side and fight your way through the camp. Secure the gates. And the sons of Levi did what Moses said. And over 3,000 people are going to be killed in the fighting. That's a lot of people. And then there's this line at the end. This is where Moses says, today you have been ordained for the service of the Lord. It's this action that sets Levi up as the priestly tribe. It's the fact that they were the ones who responded to defend and to protect Israel, not just from physical threats, but from supernatural threats as well. You're going to see this play out later with Phinehas and several other stories. There is an element of supernatural reality overlaying the physical events of the story. And so, yes, is there a physical battle? You betcha. Is there also a supernatural reality taking place? Yes. This is the moment when Levi has earned its place. God has always known this, and he's had this calling on them. But they've responded, and they've responded right. They've responded well. Even Aaron seems to have got with the program here and said, okay, this is all my fault, but I'm still with the Lord. I repent. I return. So let's jump down a little further into verse 30. Jacob, would you read that?
I'm going to read it in the NIV, though.
Okay.
The next day Moses said to the people, you have committed a great sin, but now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. So Moses went back to the Lord and said, oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They have made themselves gods of gold. Gods.
Yep, plural.
But now please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book you have written. The Lord replied to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. Now go, lead the people to the place I spoke of, and my angel will go before you. However, when the time comes for me to punish, I will punish them for their sin. And the Lord struck the people with a plague because of what they did with the calf Aaron had made.
Now, this is an interesting set of scenarios, and this is my favorite Moses moment. This is the moment that sets Moses aside from all the other prophets. Moses offers to die for the people. And as today is the day before Easter, we're recording this, I can't help but see Jesus foreshadowed in this event. It isn't that Israel was innocent. It isn't that they were just, they didn't understand, or maybe it was viewed the wrong way. They have done something terrible. They've done something wicked, and they have been proud of it. They've tried to fight and defend it, and Moses intercedes for his people yet again. He goes back up the mountain. He says, I'll return to the Lord. Maybe I can fix this. Maybe I can bring about peace between you and God. And he goes back to the Lord, and he says, they have made themselves gods of gold. But now, if you will forgive their sin, please forgive these people. Not because they're owed the forgiveness. The whole premise of this isn't, wow, Levi did awesome. They earned their place as priests. The whole point of this is that Aaron failed and made the golden calf. The whole point of this is that mankind cannot fix this on its own. We are guilty. If God is going to be with us, God is going to have to come to us because we for certain can't get to him. There's this element of guilt that hangs over the people. And Moses says, listen, if they have to die, blot me out of the book that you have written. We can get into a whole thing about the books of life. The idea here is, let me die. If you're going to judge them, judge me with them, because I'm one of them. And there's this element that we see Jesus, he doesn't just die because mankind needs us to. He is human. He is the human. He dies so that we might live. He brings us into death and through death into life. There's this beautiful completion that we see hinted at with Moses. And God looks to Moses and more or less says, I see what you've done there. I'm going to do more with that later. But right now you need to know that there is a judgment coming for the people for what they've done. I think this is the most beautiful text about Moses in the whole Torah.
So as much as Moses wanted to atone for the people, he wasn't able to. The Lord, it's not that he rejected his offer, but he does say, no, the people that have sinned against me are going to be visited. I'm going to visit their sin upon them.
And this is after the battle. 3,000 people have already died. And God isn't satisfied. He didn't look down and say, hey, I saw that you guys wiped out some of the bad guys. I'm happy enough. We're going to count that. The Lord seems to say, no, I'm going to bring judgment. This isn't something that's done by the hands of the priests. Judgment doesn't come because a group of humans have decided to bring it. The judgment that's coming is coming from the hand of God.
So is the plague that follows in verse 35, is that the judgment he's speaking of?
Yeah, we're going to get deep into this plague thing because it kind of stands out as like on its own line. Everything was fine. God said, I'm going to bring judgment. Oh, by the way, there was a plague and it was really, really bad. He set a plague on the people because they made the calf, the one that Aaron made. Poor Aaron, yet again. There's this purposeful connection of this deed with Aaron. Even though Levi is the one that rallies around Moses, Levi is also the tribe that brought about the golden calf. There isn't a sinless human in this story. There isn't someone who's able to bear the sins of the world. There's no one who can take away what they've just done. It stands on its own. And so there's this element of a story yet unfolding. And I think it's lovely.
And a big connection that I'm getting with this Moses, and like you mentioned him to Jesus, he's going to God and he's basically giving God a suggestion. That's how I'm reading into this. Like, hey, if I can just die for these people and they not have to deal with this, which is a foreshadowing of what Jesus is going to do. But it's very interesting to me because Moses is saying, hey, just let me be the one. Let me be the sacrifice and these guys can go free. But when you fast forward to Jesus and he's in the garden before he's arrested, Jesus is almost saying the opposite.
Yeah.
Jesus is saying, hey, if this cup can pass from me, do it, but the Father's will be done, not mine. And so it's very interesting because neither one of the people, Jesus or Moses, get what they want. Moses doesn't die for these people's sins, and Jesus doesn't get the cup passed from him at the time. They're both going to the Father trying to figure out a different plan of action to go through with this, but God says, no, my will is going to be done.
And I think it's interesting, too, because Moses, at the call of Moses, he's really not on board with being the guy. Please send someone else. And then the helper that God gives him is his brother Aaron. And Aaron's the one who leads the people into this sin.
He's a big help.
Yeah, a huge help. I appreciate your effort here. Aaron's going to fall. So are Aaron's sons. We're going to see their in the book of Numbers, it says that they're actually struck dead for what they were doing in the tabernacle, attempting to manipulate the worship of the Lord.
And the reason I bring that up is because everybody sees Jesus in the garden and they say, yeah, I would see why you would pray for that. I don't want to go to the cross. Jesus didn't want to go to the cross, really. I mean, his flesh side of him didn't want to. The God side of him knows what the full picture is. And so it's easy for us to be like, well, I don't want to have to do all of that hard labor and stuff. But even when Moses is giving a suggestion, which seems like a really good suggestion, let me be Jesus, right? Like, let me be the sacrifice. Let me take the place of this. Paul says it too. Let me give up his own salvation just so somebody else would be able to have it. But God isn't interested in that either. So even when the suggestion seems to be like a really good plan, God's like, don't you know I have this all planned out, like beginning to end? I
think
see it
that's
all.
what you have to come away with here is to recognize that Jesus is better. God is greater than what we're dealing with here.
Mm-hmm.
That, yeah, you could come up with a solution and you could go to God and say, all right, God, I figured it out. Here's the plan.
Yeah.
But that's us doing what the Levites
Even
or
when
what Aaron and his people were doing. Don't worry, God, I'll fix it.
Even when Moses' suggestion seems like a God thing, like this seems what God would do in this situation, right? Like, hey, God, this is in your character. This is, a part of your plan. God says, no, it's not a part of my plan. I know my plan, and I'm going to bring it to fruition. And as of right now, I'm asking you not to die for these people, even though it seems like, the God thing to do. And that's where I really struggle with in times of things, because I'll think like, man, WWJD here, right? What would Jesus do? And then I'm like, I'll just do that. And maybe that's not exactly what I need to be doing in this situation, because I'm figuring that out by myself.
So we got to remember, Jesus is fully God and fully man. He is asking the Lord, he says, if it's possible, let this cup pass for me.
Mm-hmm.
But the emphasis of Christ's prayer is, but your will be done.
Exactly.
I am here to serve you. Moses is giving us real Jesus reflections here. He is, and I don't know of another prophet that does this. He is unlike the others in the sense that he's not just bringing a message, but he is interceding for the people. And he says, nevertheless, God says, in the day when I visit, I will visit their sin upon them. And the Lord sent a plague on the people because they made the calf, the one that Aaron made. Now, us as New Testament church-going people might read that ending and go, no, you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to say, oh, you've repented and you're sorry and everything is better. Instead, what's happening here is it doesn't seem as though the war is over. And this phrase feels weird sometimes to people reading this, almost like a Post-it note stuck on the bottom. Oh, and by the way, there was a really bad plague. On with the story. And so I wonder, and we're going to get into this, is there some cultural odd thing happening here in the text that connects to plagues and connects to the worship of these gods? And I think absolutely there is. And in order to understand it, I'm going to walk you through some texts of Scripture, and we're going to begin in the New Testament. What does the New Testament say about this? How does the death of Jesus and the life of the church, how does this change the way that we view what's happening here with Moses? And so we're going to jump into chapter 7, where we find the very first martyr of the faith. There's a man named Stephen, and he is giving and preaching the gospel, and he knows his life is on the line, and he is about to preach a sermon that is one of the coolest sermons in the whole New Testament. And we're reading this, and he's going to break down the story. And in this history of Israel, where he's showing God's faithfulness in Jesus as the God of Israel, he remembers this story. Now, maybe this is what that text meant when it talked about to the derision of your enemies, is that it comes up in stories later on. But let me see. Nick, have you got Acts 7:39? Can you read down to 43?
Our fathers refused to obey him, but thrust him aside, and in their hearts they turned to Egypt, saying to Aaron, "Make for us gods who will go before us. As for this Moses who led us out from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." And they made a calf in those days and offered a sacrifice to the idol, and were rejoicing in the works of their hands.
Okay, we're going to pause there. This part sounds familiar, right? They are looking back to Egypt. They are wondering what happened to Moses, and they are sacrificing to this idol, who is here used plural, okay? So this isn't just Yahweh. They seem to have elevated other spiritual beings alongside of Yahweh, and they're worshiping them. They're honoring the host of heaven. Keep going, Nick.
But God turned away and gave them over to worship the host of heaven.
Now, that phrase is not in the Exodus text. When you read through that, you're not going to find a place where it says this. But Stephen definitely thought that. He didn't read that text and think, they were just trying to worship Yahweh the best way they knew how. He recognizes that this isn't something that stands alone, but there is a supernatural element to what was happening in the story. They are worshiping the host of heaven. And so as recent members of the Egyptian society, they know lots of gods. They know the gods of Mesopotamia. They know the gods of Canaan. They know the gods of the wilderness. They know the gods of the Egyptians. There is a buffet of supernatural beings and their stories to pick from. And so if you were going to choose what gods to honor, you'll notice Exodus doesn't name them. They're stripped of their name. They're not given the glory of even being included in the story. The only God named is Yahweh. The only God that's named is the God that created all things. These other beings are kind of lumped together as the losers. Their idol is broken. It's ground into dust, and the people drink it in the waters. But when Stephen read this text, and when he was talking to the people, he didn't connect this with a group of people who were questioning the existence of God. He connected it with a group of people who had lost loyalty to God. He isn't saying that they didn't believe in God anymore. These people saw the sea split. They saw what God did. They understood that. But are they only going to be loyal to that God? Or will they try to define right and wrong for themselves? Will they try to manipulate this? And here he says in verse 42, they are worshiping the host of heaven. That is a phrase that refers to supernatural beings. It's talking about the fallen watchers. It's talking about the lowercase g gods. And then he does something fascinating because he jumps out of the Torah and into the prophets. This is something the Sadducees would have hated and the Pharisees would have liked because they were pro-prophets. Suddenly, he is quoting from the book of Amos. Now, you probably didn't read Amos for your devotions this morning. I haven't met too many people who they just, every week I read Amos. I just love it to death. There are parts of Amos that are very strange, and one of them is going to deal with this because it connects to the worship of false gods. So, Nick, now that we've teed that up, would you kind of read for us that next part?
Continuing in 42.
Yeah, read 42 again.
Said, as it is, but God turned away and gave them over to the worship of the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of the prophets, did you bring to me slain beasts and sacrifices during the 40 years in wilderness, O house of Israel? You took up the tent of Moloch, the star of your god, is that Rephan?
Mm-hmm.
Images that you made to worship, and I will send you into exile beyond Babylon.
So he's blending all of these things together, all of these moments where Israel goes after false gods. And he says, these are all like the same thing. You were tempted with the same thing. Am I loyal to the Lord or not? And we've talked about Baal, and we've talked about their fall into worship at different places. But this is interesting because what he's talking about here is that Israel isn't just worshiping Yahweh. They're trying to bring other gods alongside of Yahweh to make sure that these gods wield their power for their benefit. This is something God is totally against. In the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, into the prophets. By the way, it calls it the book of the prophets. It doesn't say Amos, because in ancient Judaism, all the prophets were one book. There wasn't like a book of Amos, and it was all one scroll. But this is interesting because he actually, in his quotation here, changes some of the words, specifically the names of these deities. We're supposed to read this and think Israel is not loyal to Yahweh, even though they swore they would be. They are now flirting with the demonic powers.
What do you mean by they changed the names?
Well, there is a god that's worshipped in Moab called Moloch.
Okay.
If you go back and you read this quote in Amos, you
Okay.
won't find the name Moloch. You're going to find another name given. It's the name Succoth. And so
Oh,
it
I
seems
see.
to be that there isn't a one-to-one correspondence between the gods and the names that humans use for them. Just because a group of humans call him Moloch or call her Succoth, there is a supernatural reality that is behind these things. And so he's using here different names, and this was popular in the Roman world to blend different deities together and to say, well, this god is an archer, so it's probably the same god as our god over here that's an archer. And there's this element of identifying this being. One of the things that I find as we talk about territorial spirits is a lot of people want to know exactly where Zeus is, where Apollo is, where Baal is. And I got news for you guys. These are names that humans made up or were given to them by demons, and you can't trust what demons and false spirits say. Just because it says, hey, my name is Bob, doesn't mean that's its name. Mm-hmm. Just because it says, I'm in charge of pestilence, doesn't mean it's in charge of pestilence. That's when you're reading mythology, it's beautiful, but it's also propaganda. This is something that they want you to believe about themselves. Amos doesn't use the word for Moloch. Instead, he references Succoth. And Succoth is a god that was brought to Israel by the Samaritans. When the Assyrians capture all the Israelites and send them away, they brought all these pagans and brought them back and settled them in the land, and they brought their god with them. And so Amos is using a word that would have been very familiar to the culture that he's working for or living with. And then when we get to the book of the New Testament, it's as though Stephen looks at this and says, you can call it a potato or a potato, but we all know what it is. It's a false god. It's this shifty, serpent-like being. Stephen mentions also another god called Rephan or Rephesh. And that's an ancient deity whose name literally means burning one or to set aflame. Now, we remember back in the Genesis story that Nakash, the word for serpent, literally means burning one, to pulse with light. The only known source of light in the ancient world is fire. And so a burning one this is a supernatural
Is this
being.
why it says the star of your God, Riphan?
Yeah, that's
or
exactly
whatever,
why.
is the burning
They were
one?
connecting the movement of the stars. Remember, with these demonic beings, with these fallen powers. Even what the Bible says there, Stephen says they were worshiping the host of heaven. That's star language. If you're interested in this, we've talked quite a bit about it in the past, and I can't defend this whole thing here at the podcast, but what I am saying is that what's cool here is that Stephen is giving us a little bit of a window into what was happening behind the curtain. I think Stephen understood and knew what was happening. And he says, listen, you weren't just worshiping Yahweh. You were also worshiping these other gods. Now, whether their name is really Rephesh or Succoth, I don't know. But these are names that the Israelites of Moses' day would have known. These are gods that were honored in Egypt. Rephesh or Rephan is a really a strange one. He's an underworld deity, a protector of the graves of people, the royal necropolises. And it's interesting because this is a god that's worshipped not only in Babylon, but also in Egypt. The Israelites coming out of Egypt would have known about this. And what's interesting about them is that this god is supposedly the god that is connected to plagues and epidemics. So if you want to make sure that no plague falls on you as a people, worship Rephesh. Worship these gods. There's not a one-to-one correspondence to the ancient gods. It seems that the same beings presented themselves under various names. But ancient peoples sometimes personified natural events and worshipped them as gods, something the fallen watchers would have totally approved of. they would have been like, oh, yeah, you should totally worship lightning. By the way, did I mention I'm the god of lightning? You
I
should
was going to
worship
say,
me.
by natural events, do you mean like an epidemic or a
Yeah, like an
plague or-
epidemic. Why is everyone suddenly sick? They didn't know about germs and that kind of a thing. To them, that was a supernatural thing. Something is happening here. So if you want protection from a plague, worship Rephish. If you want the Nile to flood, worship the god of the Nile.
And didn't God say there was going to be a plague coming? So why
Yeah.
wouldn't Rephish be the one you'd be
That's
worshiping?
exactly what's happening here. It seems that the Israelites were bringing in these other gods alongside of Yahweh. And so if they're worshiping Rephish, which is the god that Stephen specifically mentions, it's kind of spitting in his eye to say, oh, you thought this would protect you from plagues? No, I am the Lord of hosts. There's no one that can stop me from judging. There's no one that can stay my hand. If the gods of Egypt couldn't protect you, what makes you think the gods of other nations are going to protect you from me? I am not your enemy. I offered you fellowship with me. You're supposed to be with me. I'm going with you. There's this element of family and community, and Israel has flipped it all upside down, and it's about using and power and manipulation of others and magic and the occult. And I can't help but notice that the judgment that God brings on Israel is a plague. Every Israelite who got sick must have thought to themselves, boy, Rephish is really not doing their job. This,
Lame.
yeah, I don't think this God is up to snuff. I don't think this is someone that we should be worshiping.
But why wouldn't it? I mean, for me, all these plagues happened to the Egyptians, and they're acting like the Egyptians, and so I will do to you what happened to them. I mean, it
Yeah,
seems to be a
exactly.
correlation there.
Yeah, there is a correlation there. They have fallen right back. Their eyes are towards Egypt, and they're quick to forget.
And when you're naming off all of these guys, I just watched the Prince of Egypt actually this morning with my son. I haven't seen
okay.
it in forever. But when Moses throws down the staff, the other two guys come in and they start naming off all these gods and enchanting them and everything. But I just am reminded of when the scriptures talk about God being a jealous God. And, you know, if you read that for face value, it seems like God is mad when you're worshiping somebody else because he'd rather get all of the attention and he'd rather get all of, you know, what's going on. But I don't think it's as far as that standpoint, but Yahweh is saying, I created everything, and you guys are going off on these other gods because it's going to benefit you. You're looking for yourself. And all God wants is the relationship with them. This is a baby thought I'm trying to reach out here, so it's kind of rough. But when he looks at this and he says, you went to Rephish because he's going to protect you from me, I'm not here to smite you down. I want to have a loving relationship with you, and that's all you have to do is come to me and have a relationship. So I think God is looking at it from two different ways because God created the spiritual being behind this name Rephish.
That's right.
And he created the Israelites. And both of them are now in rebellion against him. And so God is saying, don't you two fall in love with each other. Both of you love me, and then everything will go as planned. And I think that's where the jealousy comes in because he's like, I have this all planned out. I have it all right. Just follow me and
not
do
just
that.
planned out, but God is worthy of our worship. And these other beings are not. They're imitators. They're liars. They are not legitimate powers in this sense. They have rebelled against the King of Kings. And so there is an element in which I think God is not only judging Israel, but also the gods that Israel had turned their eyes to. And we have precedents for this in Exodus 12:12. When it says that God judged not only Pharaoh, but also the gods of Egypt. There are times in the Bible when the Israelites seem to have personified physical, natural events as gods. We're going to look at a couple of these because they're going to actually help us understand a little bit about what's happening here. And so let's jump to the book of Habakkuk. You have to huck when you say it. Habakkuk 3:3-6. Rose, would you read that?
I will take this, but there are probably going to be some words that I'm going to make up as I go.
Fantastic.
All right. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, Deber
Deber is the word there.
and plague,
Rephish.
followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways.
Now we're going to take a look at this. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. This is more of that Yahweh from the south tradition. I don't know where the mount called Sinai is at, but it connects with this. This is what it's talking about. This is God's moving of Israel out. And it says that God reveals his glory. Remember when they saw the mountain, it was flashing fire and thunder, and it was obvious this is a supernatural event. This is not just normal mountainish behavior. And so all of a sudden, this says, the brightness was like the light rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence. That's a proper noun. It's a god that was worshipped by the Canaanites called Deber. And plague, Rephesh, followed at his heels. And so the idea is you guys are worshiping these gods and pretending that they're the ones who bring pestilence and plague and healing and all these things. And what I'm telling you is these are irons in God's golf bag. Like, he doesn't need to ask Deborah's permission. He just does it. These aren't gods who have power over these things. God is the one who destroys them.
And you can see how frustrating it is for God because both parties understand worship, and it comes naturally to us. I mean, even the scripture tells us that we are designed to worship. Like, that is what we are created for, and we are just spewing it into the wrong direction, basically.
Yeah, there's a connection here that mankind was made to worship God. The nations were made to worship God, and these beings were meant to draw mankind back. Deuteronomy 32 talks about this. You notice there's a connection again to the nations in verse 6. He looked and shook the nations. The eternal mountains were scattered. Now, where are the eternal mountains? I mean, I lived for a long time in the Appalachian Mountains, and they're pretty old, but they're not eternal. This sense in which this is saying that there are powers, there are this element of supernatural language that's being used again. His ways are everlasting. These other mountains, they may seem eternal, they may seem spiritual, they may seem like gods. They sink low. They bow their head. Remember when God humbles Satan in the garden, it says, on your belly you shall go, and dust shall you eat. That idea of crawl on your face before me. This is language used to a defeated king. If you were an Egyptian pharaoh and you had just, dominated some Canaanite city, that's the kind of thing you would go home and carve on your walls. I made the king of random city crawl on his belly, and dust he ate. It sounds epic and warfare-like. This whole thing is supernatural warfare, not against Israel. They're part of this. They're swept up in it. But God doesn't destroy Israel. It's a very small number of people who really are taken out by this. Instead, the judgment is not only on the rebel leaders here, but also on these supernatural powers. It says God has power over these things. His ways are everlasting ways. And so when it talks here about pestilence and plague, those are the names of Canaanite deities. That's for sure. But it isn't saying they work for God. It's saying that the attributes that you give to these beings aren't theirs. They're not theirs. The Lord doesn't need to ask their permission if he's going to rise from the dead. Excuse me, death, I'd really like to resurrect on this Sunday. So if you could schedule me in, early in the morning before my friends show up at the grave, that would be nice. And the other gods are like, well, let me check on that. Let me see if I have an availability on that day. That's how the pagans talk about things. The gods interact with each other. They make treaties with each other. There are marriages. There are alliances. They treat them like humans. God doesn't do that. He speaks, and it's so. This is a famous text, though you may not recognize it at first, and it comes from the book of Hosea, chapter 13 and verse 14. Would one of you guys read that for me?
I shall ransom them from the power of Sheol. I shall redeem them from death. O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your sting?
Compassion is hidden from my eyes. Now, this is interesting because it, again, seems to be personified. He's talking to someone named Death. The Canaanites worship a god called Mot. There he is. He says, you know what? Where is the power of death? Where's the power of death? Oh, grave, Where are your plagues? Oh, at grave, where is your sting? He says, where's your crew, death? Where's your lackeys? Where's the guys that follow you around? The Lord says, no, I don't need your permission. I've come to break your power. God doesn't need to make a deal with death in order to rise. He is the Lord of life. He took the keys. There are beings that have tried to rebel against God, tried to set themselves up as replacements for or as rivals to. But in the end, he's the Lord of lords, the God of gods, mighty and awesome. There's this archer motif that's connected with Rephish, as though like, oh, I see you over there, I'm going to shoot you with some plague. And we find this specifically mentioned in Psalm 91. That was really big during coronavirus. He gets a shout out there. But I like the reference that's found in Ephesians. Let's turn our eyes to the New Testament here and look at Ephesians 6, 10 through 12, and also verse 16.
I think Nick's got this memorized right now.
Yeah, Nick preached a really great series on this. He's been all about the armor of God. Take me through here, Nick.
Ephesians 6, finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil.
So we're going to pause here. There are schemes of the devil to lead you into sin. It isn't just that Israel was in the wilderness and messed up. There is a tempter. There is a temptation that's here. There is a blending of supernatural evil and human depravity that results in this, and it could easily happen to you. Now, probably you're not going to be tempted to go and make a golden calf. I'm not tempted to go and make golden anything. And I'm not a very good
I don't have the
sculptor.
money to.
Yeah,
so.
it's out of my price range, yeah. And so when I look at this, I recognize, okay, this isn't something that's unique to me, but this is also something that I should recognize has been happening in the story going backwards. Now, remember Flip Wilson, right? The devil made me do it. The devil doesn't make you do anything. You have to choose to willingly walk into this sin. And sure, there are beings that would love to take advantage of what you're doing, and they'll lie to you. They'll claim to be more powerful than they are. Nick, would you keep reading there?
For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one.
So the darkness that's scheming against us, just like it was against Israel, this isn't something that used to happen. This is something that does happen. And it's going to look different. In your life, it may have to do with bitterness or forgiveness or, faithfulness. 1,000 ways you can apply this. But you have to remember that your sin isn't just a personal decision. You are waging war against the God who loves you and bought you with his blood, that he died for your sins. And when you sin, it isn't just that you're making a bad decision, it's that you are aiding the enemy. Christian, you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to be angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down on your wrath. Don't make peace with sin. Keep the warfare going. You're pushing against the enemy here. But our enemy isn't the people. It's not the people. Moses didn't go up on the mountain and say, you're right, God, these guys, they stink. Let's just kill them all, and I'll be the new Abraham. That sounds good. I'll just take that on myself, and we'll move on from there. And instead, Moses intercedes for the people. There's this sense of love and compassion that's modeled for us here by Moses. Christ has died for all of mankind. Our enemy isn't people, but it's the dark. It's the powers, it's the principalities, it's the rulers of the darkness of this world. And then he does something interesting because he uses a very Old Testament image, that of the archer shooting problems your direction. He says, take up the shield of faith. And we jumped ahead a little bit there. And it hurt Nick to do that because that's his jam. He says, listen, if you take up the shield of faith, you can extinguish the fiery darts of the evil one. If I want to keep the false gods from shooting me with their problems, I don't worship them. I don't give them honor. I don't give them sacrifices. I don't pay the ransom. I don't negotiate with terrorists. I have faith in the God that made me. My faith in Christ is what delivers me from evil. It's my love of God that is important. And so when I read this, what was it that opened up Israel to this sin? It wasn't that the gods just, they invaded and they waved that carrot and they just had to follow along. It's that they were tempted and they willingly fell into sin. They chose to do this.
You think they lost their faith?
I think that they lost their loyalty. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was thinking
Faithfulness in that instance.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I like this translation here. It says, in all circumstances, take up the shield of faith. That covers pretty much all circumstances. And they had been taken from bondage and freed and been promised to be led into a land flowing with milk and honey, but apparently it was also flowing with territorial spirits that were going to have to be
crawling with them.
Right,
Yeah.
driven out or conquered or something. And God was just taking too long. You know, he hauled Moses up there and they were setting the terms of everything. And they're like, well, we're just going to find someone else to take us into there. And, you know, it's like in every circumstance, don't let down your shield of faith. I really needed to hear that right now, to be honest.
Hold it. A shield is more than just a passive thing. A shield is a weapon. You attack with a shield. If you just hold it out there and wait for the enemy to whack on it, that's a problem. But its major function is this way. It's great at blocking arrows. It's great at stopping that distance attack because it's a barrier between you and the problem, between you and the sin. That's what our loyalty to Christ is supposed to do. We don't overcome the enemy by knowing their names. We don't overcome the enemy by memorizing spells. We don't overcome the enemy with garlic and holy water and crosses and all the bells and whistles that Hollywood promotes.
Essential oils.
Essential oils. Can we talk about that? I'm going to get a lot of angry moms out there who are suddenly...
He makes fun of my diffuser, guys.
She has a cauldron.
It's not a cauldron.
It's totally a cauldron.
It's a diffuser.
It's her winter solstice witch cauldron.
It does bubble.
Toil and trouble.
And it smells good.
It does smell good, but it does look very witchy. But this idea is bigger than just, okay, you sinned. No, you fought against your Lord. You betrayed the Lord. That's what Christ is forgiving. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Mankind can't fix this. The only one who can defeat death is God. He doesn't need death's permission. He doesn't need pestilence's permission or the gods of the ancient world. He is the God of gods. One of my favorite passages because of Michael Heiser is Psalm 82. It talks about the gods being judged. But there's another really good one in Psalm 58. And we're going to end by reading this text. Would one of you guys read Psalm 58?
Do you indeed decree what is right, you gods? Do you judge the children of man uprightly? No, in your hearts you devise wrongs. Your hands deal out violence on earth. The wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray from birth, speaking lies. They have venom like the venom of a serpent, like the deaf adder that stops its ear, so that it does not hear the voice of charmers or of the cunning enchanter. O God, break the teeth in their mouths. Tear out the fangs of the young lions, O Lord. Let them vanish like water that runs away. When he aims his arrows, let them be blunted. Let them be like the snail that dissolves into slime, like the stillborn child who never sees the sun. Sooner than your pots can feel the heat of thorns, whether green or ablaze, may he sweep them away. The righteous will rejoice when he sees the vengeance, for he will bathe his feet in the blood of the wicked. Mankind will say, surely there is a reward for the righteous. Surely there is a God who judges on earth.
Surely there is a God who judges on earth. This is a text where he's calling out the watchers, calling out the false gods. He says, you decree wrongly. You have led the people into sin. This should sound a lot like Psalm 82. It just does. And I love the line, God, break the teeth in their mouths. That's very visceral, like punch them right in the face.
There's another psalm, I think it's Psalm 3. He says the same thing. He's like, strike the cheek of the wicked and break their teeth.
Yeah, I mean, that's a strong punch. Mm-hmm. The arm of the Lord is mighty. It is he who judges on the earth. There is no other God. There is no other power worthy of worship. There is no one above him. Has he created other things? Yeah. But temptation is overcome through faith in Christ, through loyalty to the Lord. I hope that this text has helped you think about this a little bit. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that Jesus is the God of gods, the Lord of lords, mighty and awesome.